The Judicial Service Commission has decided to advise President Cyril Ramaphosa not to appoint a judge president at the KwaZulu-Natal High Court Division at this stage. As we've just been reporting, the Deputy Judge President Madondo was interviewed for the vacant position and facing a barrage of tough questions about comments that he made about homosexuality in that book, the title of which was Revelation of God's Truth and Plan. To discuss this and some of the other issues that came up at the Commission interviews, we're joined by legal analyst Mpumelelo, Zikalala and Mbekezeli Benjamin, Judges Matter Research and Advocacy Officer. Good evening and thank you so much for being with us. These interviews are becoming more and more fascinating and really interesting to watch because sometimes, you know, as members of the public, you think, something should just be obvious, especially when it comes to qualifications and vetting and so on. But I want to kick off, if I may, Mr. Zikalala, with you, talking about what we've just been reporting on there, insofar as the Deputy Judge President, Isaac Madondo, is concerned. I mean, he's feeling insulted that he's now being labelled homophobic. Just share with our viewers why he's defending this accusation insofar as it relates to that 2019 book that he wrote.
When he was conducting his interview, he was at pains to mention that all that he was doing in that particular book was merely interpreting what the Bible has said, and not necessarily his own views, as I would have heard him a number of times trying to explain why the content of that particular book or his extracts were pertaining or should not be viewed as being homophobic. I think in him trying to do that and the questions and the comments that came from the commissioners, it was quite clear that certain commissioners had already drawn to a certain conclusion, and they would have thought, or the only thing they could conclude to that his particular remarks are homophobic and they should not be utilized. And I certainly, maybe they would have thought he is not suitable for him to be part of or to be the JP of KZN, which is quite unfortunate taking into account the time which is attached to him. I think the number of years that he has to spend on the bench are quite limited, and there's going to be a limited number of time in which he can have, even if there's another space open for him to reapply again. But what then comes through is what I've always advocated for, which is the open questions when it comes to the JSC. Members of the public must be given assurance that the person that they have there as the judicial presiding officer is such of a clear mind and is one which can be able to answer and be able to be objective, so that they have confidence in the manner in which they need to answer to. I'd rather appear in front of a judge in which I know where his stance are in certain social questions than a judge who his particular social stance have been hidden. And I think in this case, Judge Madondo was at pains to explain that when it comes to his judgments, he is more or less clear and he subscribed to what the Constitution says. However, I do not think that the commissioners were persuaded.
Well, it didn't seem like they were persuaded. You had commissioners like Kameshni Pillay, who said that she read that whole chapter, and it certainly seemed to be some of the conclusions that he was drawing in that chapter seemed to be personal conclusions. I take the point, Mr. Zikalala, that you're making around not losing, the experience that someone has and, kind of listening in a way to his defense of those comments, not influencing his judgments that are made, but certainly in judgments that speak to his decision-making on that point, there is a risk of influence, there's a risk of prejudice. What happens in a case like this now? I mean, would there be a retrospective view of his judgments that he might have made? How much does it kind of damage his standing?
Maybe somewhere they would reread his judgments, especially when the issues of gender and that are included. Maybe they may come back and say, well, let's relook at his stances here. Are they really based on legal principles that must be followed? The most important question being, are they in line with the principles in the spirit of the Constitution and in the rights entrenched in Chapter 2 of our Constitution? If they are not, let's take them on either on review on that particular basis and maybe even on appeal. But what is most important when it comes to this type of matters, in which I think commissioners should mostly concentrate on, they should rather look and say, in the judgments that we have issued, are there any instances or chances or any sort of indications of instances where you have not been an objective presiding officer? That is what we want. What we can't run away from is that an individual will always be entitled to their own independence thinking and what they like and what they don't like. What is wrong with that particular view and point is when they pronounce it and they use their own preferences on issues which are constitutionally based and which they ought to be objective as per the principles of the Constitution. Now, if you can't prove that, and there's no instances of that, only then you can make those type of utterances. If you can't, then you must give it to that individual in question and say, yes, you have passed the test of being objective. Let's then move on and check other competencies, and maybe you would find things which you will not be good at. But on this one, in terms of being objective, you have passed that particular test.
Just a quick word. I mean, we'll come back and look at, the work of the JSC overall. Just a quick word before I turn it over to Mr. Benjamin. So his position in the role that he currently serves, which is Deputy Judge President, that's not at risk.
It may. Let's remember, at the end of the day, regardless of which hierarchy he's in, at the end of the day, he's a presiding officer. He sits in court and listens to cases. Now, when a case of which was just gender-based, which has to do with the LGBTI gender community comes in, one of the stances in which, when a person representing that particular grouping would have to come in, is to check: are you going to be objective or not? And the stances in which he is able to determine that is that in his ruling, if there are any instances of any chances of him being prejudiced or being biased or being discriminatory to any of the individuals that are concerned, that is when you raise that particular point. So regardless of the position in which he's been appointed in, at the end of the day, he's a presiding officer. What they were looking at now is whether, are you going to be a good leader when it comes to making sure that the KwaZulu-Natal Provincial Division is working optimally? If you've passed the test of being the presiding officer, let's look at your management skills moving forward. Are you able to manage and take this particular division to greater heights? And if you can't, then you're not suitable. If you can, then let's take it. But we'll have the safeguard of the provision of saying, if there are any instances in which we are not going to be objective, we are not going to be in line with what a presiding officer ought to be, then there are safeguards in which litigants can go and say, please recuse yourself, either during those particular proceedings or when the match has been concluded. And say, let's review your decision, because you're not being objective in this particular stance. And it helps if you know that what is the stance of the individual that is there.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to certainly be an interesting one to watch. And watching with great interest is, as this sort of qualifications issue comes up again. And, we kind of place judges and people who are really, at that level in our society, above reproach when it comes to making good decisions. But this issue of his qualifications, Ruben Nkosi I'm talking about now, Mr. Benjamin, being repeatedly criticized for having listed additional qualifications of a US degree from a university that is not recognized. I mean, that is just downright embarrassing.
Yes, it certainly was, Iman. I think the real question, though, was not that he went and got a degree from a non-recognized university, but just the question of the integrity of it all. Is that when you're a judge, you're supposed to scrutinize information very carefully. You're supposed to look at volumes and volumes of information, process that information, and take a decision based on that. So if you can't verify whether a university is recognized or not, then you are failing at the basic qualities that a judge needs for them to be effective in their job. But there was also, I think, a question of the integrity of his questions. Judge Zondo said that he's concerned that he's not being upfront with some of the answers that he gave on the question of his qualifications and the university that he got the qualifications from, but also on the judgments that he had outstanding that he had not delivered at the time of the interview.
So 2 points you raised there. Again, and thank you very much for actually teasing that point out. Being able to make a critical evaluation of something is one of the key skills that you need as a judge, to be able to see beyond things at face value and really question, the veracity of things. That would be a key attribute, and he would have failed on that score, as you've just said. And then it's also, the duplicitous nature of his answers and how he tried to get out of that. I do want to ask you, though, as well about, these judgments you mentioned now towards the end of your answer. Many judgments that he didn't finalize, but he was brought on to be an acting judge in other courts. His track record also becomes something that we've got to pay keen interest to.
Yes, absolutely. We, as Judges Matter, are in fact concerned about how you even got on the shortlist, because as we understand the process, you apply to the JSC. There is a committee called the Sifting Committee that looks at your application, and then they shortlist you for the interview. Now, we wonder how much of a due diligence is done before someone is interviewed is shortlisted for the interview, because it would have been quite clear if someone says, I have X many judgments still outstanding, then the question should have been, how did you obtain further acting appointments if you have outstanding judgments? But also, how do you meet the bar of being a qualified judge? And we do understand there are certain circumstances where someone would pick up judgments, but by the time of the interview, those judgments are dealt with. So it's a routine thing, and I don't think we should criticize him a lot on that. But when you have acted at numerous courts and you've picked up outstanding judgments in all of those courts, then clearly there's something about your work ethic that needs serious question.
Okay, and for just an ordinary member of the public such as myself, Mr. Benjamin, one would think that the primary role of a judge is to judge. So you've got to issue judgments, and at least you should have that on your CV. I want to come very quickly to the issue of the shortlisting, and Mrs. Zikalala, maybe you can pick up on this one. Mr. Benjamin was talking there about, these matters could have probably been headed off at the pass had the vetting process and the shortlisting been done accurately. Do you think this is an issue of capacity or ability? Because we know a lot of institutions are simply overburdened, they've got a lot of work to do, and maybe this is just something that was an oversight, or do you see this as a real problem?
I would say maybe because it hasn't come up in as much in the previous interviews, but it is a worrying factor, especially for the applicant. You see, when you apply and you tender your application, you are volunteering yourself to be scrutinized. And one of the things in which you ought to do is that once the information that you are going to disclose to a body such as the JSC must be accurate. You must have checked every single corner to make sure that everything that you put in that particular application is true. If it comes out that it's not true, I think then the focus is on you as the applicant to say, you are not that a diligent person that ought to be a judge at the end of the day. You don't scrutinize all the information in which you are submitting, and you have participated in an institution which is not registered. So you shouldn't even tell them that this is the institution that you participated in, because at the end of the day, it goes directly to your credibility. What you must do, though, is to commend the JSC for being able to find this type of discrepancies at this particular stage. That is why they are there, which is why the president has entrusted them in terms of saying, go and scrutinize these applicants on my behalf. Go and make sure that everything in which they're going to disclose is accurate, it is true, and they are really competent in making sure that they are the final arbiters when it comes to disputes and which South Africans will come to them in court during the normal court processes. So we must say to the JSC, you've done a good job. I think they are on the right track on this one.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to give them a rating out of 10. Mr. Benjamin, what say you?
Well, I think it's too early to give them a high rating. This week, they have performed much better than they have, at least in the last 3 to 5 years. And so I think we should give them credit for the changes that we've seen in terms of the dignity that the interviews have been conducted, the thoroughness of the questioning. There are lapses, perhaps, in some of the procedures that they followed. We know that a candidate on Tuesday was ambushed with the question that with information that he hadn't really prepared for. And so those kinds of things need to be tightened up. The JSC needs to put in place rules for how it does its interviews, and that's an important thing. This week, they gave us a criteria, which is another important factor. So overall, I'll give them a 6 out of 10.
Lovely talking to you. Thank you. They've certainly got their work cut out for them. Legal analyst Mpumelelo Zikalala and Mbekezeli Benjamin with Judges Matter, involved in research and advocacy.